The whole thing started when this property was sold for development. Now, we knew Fort Huger was here, and a number of us had been up here, but it was almost impossible to get here. You had to drive down a road at Tyler's Beach, come up, ask permission to park on somebody's property, walk along the beach, and then come up over the wall. There were some logging roads in here, but most of them were almost completely inaccessible. Once the property was sold to a company with Timberline LLC, we Historical Society folks and a lot of county representatives went to them and said, look, we want the fort. And so eventually they proffered these 23 acres and the 50-acre park. And so essentially then the developers just left it alone, and the Historical Society, along with the county government, we had a committee, we decided what we wanted to do, clear the trees, build the bridge, that sort of thing. So that's how it came about. The fort is named for Benjamin, we've always said Huger. We've had Fort Huger Drive in place for about 30 years. There is a fourth generation descendant of the general who lives in Norfolk. His name is Benjamin UG, and he pronounces it UG. But he will be the first to admit that they don't even know how it was pronounced, 150 years ago. It could have been something different. So, you can go Huger, or just, Huger is fine with us. In the Historical Society, what we like to say is no matter how you pronounce it, we're going to correct you just to establish ourselves as an authority, and be able to tell the story. So Huger is fine. Andrew Talcott, a Confederate engineer, was the designer of the fort. Lieutenant Colonel Archer was the Confederate commander of the fort. We've uncovered a number of archaeological remains of the huts. The 500 or so Confederate soldiers who were stationed here basically lived in this area. Very few lived in the fort. This is off-center, built here specifically, so when the fort was being shelled by the Yankees, the shells would overshoot and go off to the right and not land in the encampment area. But that's why the encampment area is specifically here. We're at the point where the Confederate bridge began. It was probably more a corduroy or plank road thrown down through the marsh. This bridge is a very expensive, nicely constructed modern bridge that we did so the fort would be accessible. The heavy guns, some of them weighing 5 and 6 tons, would probably not have been brought over land. They would have been brought up the water and then hauled into the fort and in place there. There are indications that the way they did that was build a large sand ramp up into the fort, haul the guns into the fort, and then destroyed the ramp. This little swamp or wetlands is the rear protection for the fort. This is the reason the fort was built where it is. The fort's just ahead. It's on a bluff called Hardy's Bluff. We have indications that there was a fort here possibly in 1623. Just after the Indian Massacre of 1622, a number of triangular forts like the one at Jamestown were built as a refuge for the settlers, the English settlers, in case the Indians decided to attack again. We pretty much know there was one of those forts at the Fort Boykin site. Here, we think so. Very, very militarily defensible. It's protected by this ravine from the rear. We're about to enter the fort. The entrance that we're going to go through is called the Sally Port, but it's sort of a Z shape. You've got a wall there right in front of you where infantrymen would have been lined up with muskets, if in fact the Federals got this far. In the ravines would have been things like chevaux de frise, Civil War equivalent of barbed wire, so to speak, to slow down an infantry attack. This would have been the route that infantry would have taken to attack the fort. But you can see the first obstacle would have been the marsh itself. By early 1862, every tree within a mile of this fort was taken down. And they did that specifically to clear fields of fire and fields of vision so they could see anybody coming. The fort was built primarily with slave labor. There is one account that indicates there was a force of 1,000 hands, and these would have been mostly slave and a number of free blacks. The Confederate soldiers who were stationed here, of course, they helped build it also. the fort is very oddly shaped. The reason for that is that is the natural geologic shape of Hardee's Bluff. In other words, they built the fort to fit the highest point of Hardee's Bluff. You see the flagpole? That's where they started to build the fort. And they just started moving the earth out, flattening it out as they went. When they got to an edge, they simply built a wall. They just kept moving, and everywhere they moved, where they got to the high bluff edge of Hardee's Bluff, that's where the wall went in. And so most of the earth that you see here, these earthen walls, it's earth from the fort itself. We don't have any record that they actually imported dirt here. They probably did, but we're not really sure. In front of you is the James River Reserve Fleet. The channel where the main attack came from is about double that distance. So these ships are about half the distance that these guns here would have had to have fired to engage the enemy ships. And then straight across is Mulberry Island, where there was another Confederate fort. Over here is a crater where the powder magazine was. The records are a little bit unclear. We're not sure who actually blew it up, whether the Southern forces did before they left or the Federals. But it was an extremely substantial structure, 4 layers of brick thick. The remaining powder, they just simply blew it up. And a lot of the bricks that you see throughout the fort, the bricks were thrown long ways. We're still finding bricks around here. Most of them came from here. We know there was a well here. That looks like a likely candidate. We're real excited, what might be in there. They may have dumped cannonballs in there, but it'd be interesting to know what's in there. We have done no reconstruction, none. What you see here is what is left from early 1862 when the Confederates left. Of course, trees grew up, a lot of it was weathered down, The walls were obviously a little bit higher, maybe a foot or 2 feet, we're not quite sure. But all the original gun embrasures are here, and we were just absolutely astounded when we got it clear that all of these features just jumped right out at us. We didn't know they were here until we cleared it. All of these guns are accurate reproductions of the guns that were here, and not only that, they're in the exact places where guns were. We knew there were 12 guns here. We knew what type of guns were here. On every terraplane where you see a gun, archaeologists found, rusted nails, spikes, things like that, where we knew a platform had been. And so that's why we put a gun there. This is the South Bastion, which is the strongest bastion of the fort, because any attack would have come from the south up the James. And so these would have been the first guns to engage a Federal attacking fleet. The holes that you see are bomb-proofs. They were dug about 6 feet down and then covered with logs and earth, and they were refuges for the gunners during an attack. They would protect themselves in there, and then once the Federal firing stopped, they would come out to their guns, man their guns, and fire back. The remains of the shell house. This is where shells, both empty and charged, were stored. Charged means they had the 8 or 10 pounds of powder in them, and they had a fuse on them, and they were ready to be fired. This is where the shells that were ready to be fired were stored. They tried to avoid shipping charged ammunition any great distance, so it was much better just to bring, thousands of fuses up here and thousands of shells and then the powder and then put them all together. One of the real interesting features of the fort was the shot furnace. Not only did virtually every seacoast fortification in America have shot furnaces, but many of the larger wooden ships had shot furnaces on them. And what they did is they heated up solid iron cannonballs now, not shell, but solid iron cannonballs. They'd heat them to red hot, and they would quickly put powder in the gun, then put some wet wadding down, and then ram the cannonball in, the red hot cannonball, and fired at a wooden ship. And that was the primary way you destroyed wooden ships. because that red hot iron ball would embed itself in the wood of the ship and set it on fire. Made obsolete by the introduction of iron ships. The USS New Ironsides was the first, the second was the Galena, and of course far and away the most successful was the Monitor. And of course once the USS Galena and the USS Monitor began to be used against these forts here, it made the shot furnaces obsolete because obviously the iron was a defense against those, the red hot shot. The red hot shot were primarily fired by the 32-pounder naval guns. The larger guns, the 8-inch Columbiads, the 9-inch Dahlgren guns, primarily fired a shell. So the shot furnace primarily supplied the 32-pound naval guns.